Yes, thank you for having me speak this afternoon. I'm really excited to talk about, obviously, the legacy that Rosalind Franklin left behind in her research, particularly on carbon-based materials, and then shed a little light onto how we're utilizing some of the findings that she developed during her time working on this nearly 70 years ago in our research program here at Dow Chemical today. So I want to step back a little backwards through Rosalind Franklin's time frame and go from, before she worked on tobacco mosaic viruses that she's very well known for, and even before Photo 51 of the DNA double helix, there was coal and graphite, which was the basis of a lot of her PhD and postdoctoral work that we heard a lot about earlier in the session. And I'm going to focus quite a bit on some of the quantitative interpretations that Rosalind Franklin was able to pull out when studying both coal and the graphitization of organic precursors, and how we can apply those for carbon molecular sieve membranes here in the industrial perspective. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think others have done a really great job at going through her background, but the two areas that big area that I really want to focus on are here in the blue blocks, and particularly her work during her PhD at the British Coal Utilization Research Association, and her time in developing and learning Xray crystallography as a postdoctoral scholar while she was in France. So one thing that's been brought out several times today while talking about Rosalind Franklin, and often when you hear people who worked with her speak about the work that she did, they talked a lot about how precise and nearly perfect her experimental techniques were. And I thought this is from one of her early papers on the true and apparent densities of coal that I thought was really elegant in how she designed and built this experimental setup to measure the true density of coal using helium as a gas. So she has all of this is in vacuum tubes, and she has her coal sample here that she knows the exact mass of. She can transfer a known volume of helium from a capsule that she knows the pressure of to fill the rest of the line and be able to calculate the actual density of the coal that's in here. Folks today, when they try and do this measurement, may have a slightly simpler description. We have our helium pycnometers, which a lot of this intricate glassware has transitioned to this pretty simple benchtop instrument where you'll load your sample in a known volume capsule. You'll introduce helium into it, and by knowing differences in the pressures of the sample, knowing differences of the pressure within your sample and the expansion chamber volume, you can then back calculate a density of your sample using the exact same mathematics that Rosalind Franklin did back in the 1940s. So what was she trying to discover when she was talking about true and apparent densities of coal materials? Well, we know coal is highly porous. As was brought out in the last talk, coal transitions from a lignite coal to a higher density bituminous coal to the highest density, highest carbon content anthracite coal. And this is an example of Rosalind Franklin's screening back in the 1940s, they call real density based on helium, and apparent density using different solvents, going from lignite coal down here to a more bituminous coal in these B and C samples to an anthracite coal in the A sample. What you can really see here is not only do you have differences in the true and apparent densities, but they follow some sort of a trend that when you have things like water, for instance, or hexane and benzene are probably the two best examples, where these are relatively large organic molecules. They don't readily transition into these micropores that are formed in these coal systems. Therefore, when you measure the density after 2 hours, it's different than the density equilibrated after 24 hours. And that's because there's a kinetic effect of the molecule finding its way into these pores, that there's constrictions in those pores that slow the molecule down. In addition to that, the final density is often lower in these large organic molecules as compared to something like helium. In these large organic molecules, the density is lower because some of these pores and some of these constrictions are actually so small that they actually sieve the molecules based on size. That the small molecules like helium, like water, can get into those materials, whereas these larger molecules like hexane and benzene are actually prevented from getting into these small pores. After she found the apparent and real densities of coals, she started to investigate what happens if you carbonize these coals further. So what's shown here on the left is actually the carbonization of one of these bituminous coals, like coal B. In this study, it was labeled coal F, but it's very similar to the coal B in the previous study. And what was seen, if we look at the helium plot, which is shown here in the X's, is that at between 500 and 700 degrees Celsius, the coal goes through a rapid densification. And actually, at its highest densities, the helium actually has this drift effect, where the density measured through helium, directly after the pressure is applied, differs from that after 24 hours of stabilization, indicating that the pores are actually getting so small that the helium molecules can no longer get into those pores, which actually brings out a really interesting phenomenon that I'll come back to about carbonization of non-graphitizing carbons, where at the highest temperatures, you actually reach a state where you get increased porosity, but those pores are actually closed off and segregated from the rest of the internal pore network. So while there is porosity, it's no longer interconnected, so you can't take advantage of that increased porosity oftentimes. What you see with the larger molecules is at lower and lower temperatures, they start to fall onto the same line as hexane, which is the large molecule that's being sieved out, which means that these effective temperatures, 700 degrees C for methanol, 800 or 900 degrees C for water, that the pores now have gotten to a size where they no longer can get into those smaller pores, making that readily inaccessible, and therefore the apparent density appearing lower. So by observing differences in the apparent and true densities in coal, Rosalind Franklin was able to describe the pore structure in these tortuous networks as containing constrictions in the pore sizes on the size of small molecules, which led her to a term that she coined in terms of carbon molecular sieves, which are a really important industrial complex moving forward. So what did she do in relating the densities to the rank and structure? Well, when we talk about low rank or lignite coals that have low carbon content, they exhibit really high porosities, and these pores are relatively large, allowing for all penetrants to reach their interior. And you can see this when you look at the very low density materials here, where the densities with helium are pretty similar to that which you're observing in hexane and benzene. However, when you reach bituminous coals or these mid-rank coals, they have the lowest porosity, but more importantly, they exhibit that molecular sieving behavior. They have a low kinetic uptake, indicating the constrictions in the pore volume, while anthracite coal actually has a lot of its porosity locked up in inaccessible pores, making it appear more dense than it is, even though it has a higher actual porosity, which you can see through things like small angle X-ray scattering, which Franklin also points out in some of her papers. Future work by Franklin on non-graphitizing carbon goes into a lot more detail on explaining these findings. So I know we mentioned this paper from 1950 a little earlier. This is her work that was in Acta Crystallographica in 1950 on the carbonization of PVDC, polyvinylidene chloride, which is more commonly known as saran or saran wrap, that she was actually able to carbonize saran at 1,000 degrees Celsius and take the X-ray scattering pattern. Now, when you think about X-ray diffraction, particularly X-ray diffraction at the time when this was done in the late 1940s, early 1950s, we're typically doing diffraction on very regular crystals. So you're dealing normally with diffraction peaks that are much sharper than what's observed in the diffuse scattering pattern here. But Rosalind Franklin was actually able to quantitatively examine this diffuse scattering pattern. The way that she went about it was actually an early use of the atomic pair distribution function. There was a really nice session on Saturday on total scattering here at the ACA, and there was a really nice talk about the history of the atomic pair distribution function. And I thought it was really interesting that they pointed out that Peter Debye and others in the 1920s were already developing the equations and the mathematics to understand doing a pair distribution function analysis. I thought that was really interesting because I normally think of that as a maybe a more advanced technique or something that required more computational power than what was available at the time. So I thought that was really interesting. But Rosalind Franklin was actually able to apply this method to quantitatively describe the char that was formed, the non-graphitic carbon that was formed from this carbonization of PVDC. So to really look at the quantitation on this, we need to look at a couple of different aspects of the atomic pair distribution function, which is shown here on the left from one of her figures in her Acta Crystallographica paper. The experimental data is the solid line, and the dashed line is the theoretical atomic pair distribution function of a pristine graphene layer of infinite size. What you can see is that the peak positions are consistent with this hexagonal rings of sp2 carbon. What that means is that the ordered part of this carbon consists of fused six-membered rings forming kind of a graphene sheet. This was really important because at the time there were conflicting accounts of, well, what is the structure of this carbon? Does it have sp3 bonding? Is it all sp2? If it's all sp2, do you have rings of different sizes? Is that the induction of the disorder? What is shown here is that that's not the case, that what you have are just sets of graphene sheets with the repeating six-membered rings. However, not all of the carbon exists in that phase. If you look at the low R, you can see that the integrated peak intensities, particularly in these first two peaks, is about 2/3 of what it should be based on the theoretical value. And the reason for that is because only about 65% of the carbon is actually located in this ordered structure, in this ordered structure. Well, if you look at higher R values, you can see that the peak intensities drastically differ, much more than by the 1/3 that's shown at low R. And the reason for that is due to the limited size of these graphene planes. These graphene planes are of limited size, so therefore these longer correlations exist at a lower frequency than they would in an infinite sheet. As a result, the intensities are much lower. You can actually, and Rosalind Franklin actually does this, is able to calculate, well, what is the actual domain size, and comes out to about 15 angstrom diameter graphene sheets. A final note that she made was that the slope of the experimental data is different from that of the theoretical data. The theoretical data should have a slope of a negative slope intensity, whereas the experimental data is almost flat. The reason for that is that there is a slight bump here at about 4 angstroms, very broad, and that is actually coming from the interplanar spacing between adjacent graphene layers in this amorphous char material. That all of this was really interesting in bringing a lot of quantitative information on a disordered system pretty early on using X-ray diffraction. The other thing that she mentioned that she did that was really powerful, I feel, and I think is exceptionally important when dealing with amorphous or disordered materials, is she brought clarity to the terminology in the lexicon that's used on how we speak about and describe carbon materials. In her seminal work in the Royal Society of London paper in 1951 on graphitizing and non-graphitizing carbons, Rosalind Franklin spends a significant of time in her introduction describing definitions for these types of materials. For instance, she describes non-graphitic carbons are carbons that have order in only 2 dimensions. For instance, if you look back here at the diffuse scattering pattern of carbon, of the carbon char, you have the OO2 reflection, and then you have HK reflections, 2-dimensional HK reflections. You have no 3-dimensional order or Bragg peaks that correspond to an HKL where L is not equal to 0. She then goes on to describe graphitizing carbons, and these are still non-graphitic carbons. However, upon heating to about 3,000 degrees Celsius, will transform into stable artificial graphite. And then you have non-graphitizing carbons, and these are non-graphitic carbons that when you heat to 3,000 degrees Celsius will not transform into graphite, but instead remain as a non-graphitic carbon. So how did she kind of differentiate these 2 types of materials? And also, what types of materials fit into these different categories? So up to about 1,000 degrees Celsius, she looked at a series of carbon precursors, things like sugar, things like PVC, PVDC, petroleum oils, coals of different rank. And she saw that up to about 1,000 degrees Celsius, all of the carbons exhibited the standard diffuse scattering of a non-graphitic carbon. They consisted of graphitic domains, so the size of the basal plane of less than 20 angstroms. They also consisted of some parallel layers, so your parallel spacing of these layers between 2 and 4. However, above 1,000 degrees Celsius to 3,000 degrees Celsius, the curves of the layer diameter versus the number of layers per parallel group. So this is pretty much the size of your basal plane relative to the number of parallel layers you have in your stack of graphite, diverged greatly between graphitizing and non-graphitizing carbons, as shown here in the plot on the right from her Proceedings of the Royal Academy paper in 1951. The triangle curves are non-graphitizing carbons, whereas the X dots are graphitizing carbons. And what you can see is in the graphitizing carbons, while you get limited growth of the basal plane size, you get significant growth of the number of layers that stack atop one another in a parallel fashion. Whereas you get the opposite kind of effect in the non-graphitizing carbons, where your layer diameter can grow relatively rapidly. However, you never really grow more than about 10 layers of parallel carbon plates, thus limiting the amount of long-range extended order that's present in these carbon materials. So this figure here from her paper in 1951, I think, is one of the long-lasting legacies of Rosalind Franklin. It's a cartoon schematic of what is the structure of graphitizing and non-graphitizing carbon. And we still use today, oftentimes, this structure on the right to describe the structure of non-graphitizing carbons, where you have these domains of nanocrystalline graphite that are isotropically distributed throughout a material that have strong organic crosslinks or curvature, as been shown later by folks like Harris in the UK, or have some degree of curvature. And that is actually what induces the higher porosity, that as you increase temperature on this, the isotropic nature of these will cause these to grow at the expense of these crosslinks or other carbon matrix that may be in there that's in part of the non-ordered carbon. However, you don't have the energy to then align these into a graphitic matrix that you actually end up with these kind of pressing against each other, making that internal porosity increase. However, you have to think of this in a three-dimensional framework, that as these heal in 3 dimensions, these will eventually close off and form shells. And that's been shown by folks like Harris in the UK, using transmission electron microscopy, that you actually end up with fullerene type structures in these non-graphitic carbons at very high temperatures. So how are we taking advantage of the findings that Rosalind Franklin has done in the field of coal and carbon research here at Dow? Well, we're actually working in the space of making novel carbon molecular sieves for gas separation membranes. So what I have here is the traditional diagram of a petrochemical facility that will turn things like naphtha or ethane or propane into ethylene or propylene. You have your high temperature furnace here that does the cracking, and then you have your big separations unit over here. A lot of people think that all the energy goes into this furnace, heats up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. However, these separations, particularly separations of ethane from ethylene and propane from propylene, often require high pressure and cryogenic distillation. That uses a lot of energy. In fact, 30 to 40% of both capital costs, that's the cost to build a new plant or facility, and the operating and energy costs occurs in this separations unit. So we've been working to develop new carbon-based membranes for gas separations relevant to this industry. The way we've been doing this is we've been taking these aromatic polymeric precursors and carbonizing them, similar to what Rosalind Franklin did in the PVDC work. We're using a lot of the models that she's developed and a lot of the tools that she used to understand the microstructure that's formed during this carbonization process. And we found that through controlling the precursor chemistry, heating conditions, and membrane form factor, that a carbon molecular sieve-based membrane can be tailored to these industrially relevant processes. What's shown here on the top right are some of those examples where we're changing precursor chemistry, as well as heating conditions and things of that nature. And we can see the drastic change on the selectivity and permeability of propane in a propane versus propylene separation process. So in summary, I want to make it clear that Rosalind Franklin has been a pioneer in the area of carbon material science, that the findings that she's done in describing the detailed pore structure and analysis within coals and the carbonization of organic materials into both graphitizing and non-graphitizing systems has really inspired generations of scientists across disciplines of chemistry, physics, and material science. You know, we're still using a lot of the insights that she came up with around the high temperature carbonization and the development of porosity during these processes to develop structure property models for materials of use in a number of industries. And I think that the techniques and the analyses she really pioneered over 70 years ago continue to provide insights to researchers in the field. So before I go, I'd like to acknowledge my team here at Dow, Abhishek Roy, Surinder Vena, Lee Tang, David Roychley, Michael Clark, Shorin Guh, and Paul Hutchins, as well as folks who inspired me to love carbon and carbon research. This started back in my PhD with John Batting at Penn State University and my collaborations with Vin Crespi and Will White while there. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for having me this afternoon, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was really fascinating, actually. I'd got no idea of the sort of current relevance of this sort of applying her results. Can I ask the first question?
Sure thing.
Perhaps from your measurements, do you think that this will actually result in a better separation protocol for you that doesn't use so much energy? I mean,
we do. So we actually have today a module down in one of our world scale cracker units here in Texas of a carbon molecular sieve membrane unit. Similar membrane units are used for other separation processes within the hydrocarbon and petrochemical industry. A lot of polymeric membranes are used. However, polymeric membranes don't really work very well with these very, very similar chemicals of things like ethane, ethylene, propane, propylene. And they also don't work very well in non-ambient conditions. So some of these applications that we're looking at may be at relatively high temperatures where the selectivity drops rapidly in polymeric membranes.
And do they go on working? I mean, what is the sort of lifetime of them? Because you can imagine that.
Yeah, so that's actually a really common problem. This paper that I actually cite here, this was a paper that I was a part of in 2019, that came out in 2019 with our collaborators at Georgia Tech. The carbon molecular sieves, one of their biggest problems is they have an issue with aging. What I mean by that is when you start out, you may start out, let's say you're here with this diamond here, and you have really high permeability and reasonable selectivity. Well, over time, your selectivity is going to continue to rise while your permeability drops. And it's because the carbon structure is not in a thermodynamically stable state. It's actually in a glassy state. So it's going to relax over time. And as it does, you actually lose more and more porosity. One thing that we are investigating that I think is really interesting is, and it actually kind of ties into one of the last speakers from before the break, when they talked about Rosalind Franklin's final paper on carbon-based materials in 1957 on the oxidation of carbon. We're actually seeing that by providing oxidation on some of these carbon materials, that it actually mitigates some of that aging phenomenon in these materials, because that oxygen will then passivate some of some of those layers, or it may remove or chew up, like was showed in the cartoon, of some of the more energetic layers that exist in these glassy materials. Yeah.
Can you revise? Sorry, I'm asking all the questions, but I don't see any others in there at the moment. But I wonder if you can revive them, or once they've become like that, whether there's any recycling possible.
So it really depends on what the mechanism for aging is. So there's two aging mechanisms. One is more of a physical aging, and that one I believe is going to be much harder to revive. That's one where you have the physical kind of aging, where it's kind of collapsing the structure and densifying over time. The second one that occurs is the carbon surface. You know this from things like using activated carbon in your water filters and things like that, right? It absorbs a lot of different small molecules from the air and from other areas. That if you get too much things like water vapor absorbed onto the carbon surface, it can actually block some of these pores. That process, we believe, is pretty easily reversible through a thermal treatment.